Welcome back to Verified Fears. Tonight we're heading to Alaska. 663,000 square miles of unforgiving wilderness where civilization ends and nightmares begin. It's a place that doesn't forgive mistakes, where some locations on the map have no names because no one ever returned to give them one. The 11 people you're about to hear from come from different backgrounds, but they all share one thing. They encountered something in Alaska that changed them forever. From frozen research stations to remote oil rigs, from villages that shouldn't exist to ferries sailing nowhere. These are their raw, unfiltered testimonies of terror that can only happen in America's last frontier. These are their stories. My name is Addison, and I'm a marine biologist. 3 years ago, I was 26 and thought I understood the ocean better than most people understand their own backyards. I had spent countless hours studying Arctic marine ecosystems, but I had never actually worked alone on the Bering Sea ice sheet during the dead of winter. When the opportunity came up to conduct ice thickness measurements for a climate research project, I jumped at it. I thought it would be the perfect way to advance my career and contribute to something meaningful. I was wrong about so many things. The research station was nothing more than a prefabricated hut sitting on 20 feet of solid ice, about 40 miles from the nearest land. It was February, which meant I was living in complete darkness for most of the day, with only a few hours of dim twilight to break the monotony. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I had my equipment, my data collection protocols, and enough supplies to last 6 weeks. The plan was simple. Take daily measurements of ice thickness using ground-penetrating radar, collect water samples from the holes I drilled, and document any changes in the ice structure. Standard stuff that I had done dozens of times before, just never alone and never in such extreme conditions. The first week went exactly as expected. I established my routine: wake up, check the weather instruments, take my measurements, record the data, eat, read, sleep. The ice was stable, averaging about 18 feet thick, and my equipment was functioning perfectly. The only sounds were the wind howling across the surface and the occasional crack of ice settling under thermal stress. These were normal sounds. Expected sounds. I had read about them in countless research papers and knew they were just the ice responding to temperature changes and pressure from the moving sea beneath. But during the second week, I started hearing something else. At first, I thought it was just the wind creating unusual resonances in the ice formations around my station. It sounded like whispers. Very faint, almost like static from a radio tuned between stations. The sounds only came at night. During the deepest part of the darkness, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning, I would be lying in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep, when I would hear these soft, indistinct murmurs coming from somewhere beneath me. I'm a scientist, so my first instinct was to find a rational explanation. I checked all my equipment for interference, thinking maybe one of my instruments was picking up radio chatter from ships or aircraft. But everything was functioning normally, and the sounds weren't coming through my radio or any other electronic device. They were coming directly through the ice itself, as if the frozen surface was somehow conducting voices from far below. I started keeping a detailed log of when I heard them, how long they lasted, and any patterns I could identify. By the third week, the voices were becoming clearer. I could distinguish different speakers, though I couldn't understand what language they were speaking. It definitely wasn't English, and it didn't sound like any of the indigenous languages I had heard during my brief time in Alaska. The rhythm was wrong, the cadence too strange. Sometimes it sounded like a conversation between 2 people, other times like a group discussion or meeting. What disturbed me most was that they seemed to be getting louder each night, as if whatever was making these sounds was moving closer to the surface. I tried drilling deeper holes in the ice to see if I could locate the source of the voices. My standard equipment could penetrate about 15 feet, but the sounds seemed to be coming from much deeper than that. When I put my ear directly to the ice surface, the voices were crystal clear, like listening to people talking in the next room through a thin wall. I could hear individual words now, though I still couldn't understand them. The conversation seemed urgent, almost heated, as if the speakers were arguing about something important. Sleep became impossible. The voices were now occurring every night, starting around midnight and continuing until dawn. They were so clear that I began to recognize individual speakers by their vocal patterns and inflections. There was one voice that appeared frequently, deeper than the others, that seemed to be asking questions or giving instructions. Another voice, higher pitched, always seemed to be responding with what sounded like protests or disagreements. A third voice would occasionally interject with short comments that caused the other two to fall silent for several minutes. By the fourth week, I was convinced that there were people trapped beneath the ice, possibly survivors from a shipwreck who had somehow created an air pocket and were trying to communicate with the surface. This explanation made sense to me, even though I knew the ice had been solid for months, and there was no way anyone could survive that long in those conditions. But I had to try to help them. I began drilling multiple holes in different locations, trying to create a communication point and shouting down into the openings. But whenever I tried to initiate contact, the voices would immediately stop. They would remain silent for the rest of the night, only to resume their conversations the following evening. The rational part of my mind knew this was impossible. The ice was too thick, too old, and too solid for there to be any kind of cavity large enough to sustain human life. But the voices were real. I was recording them every night now, and the recordings clearly captured the conversations. When I played them back during the day, I could hear them just as distinctly as when they occurred. They weren't hallucinations or products of isolation-induced psychosis. They were actual human voices speaking an actual language that I simply couldn't identify. During the fifth week, something changed. The conversations began to include words that I recognized, not English words, but words that somehow conveyed meaning despite being in a foreign language. I started to understand fragments of what they were discussing, and what I learned terrified me more than the mystery of their presence. They were talking about me. They knew I was listening. They knew I was alone on the ice above them. They were describing my daily routines, my equipment, even details about my personal life that no one else in Alaska could possibly know. They knew about my apartment back in Seattle, about my research at the university, about the argument I had with my advisor before leaving for this assignment. They discussed my family, mentioning my sister's name and the fact that she was getting married in June. How could voices coming from beneath 20 feet of ice know these intimate details about my life? The logical explanations I'd been clinging to crumbled completely. These weren't trapped survivors. These weren't radio transmissions or equipment malfunctions. These were something else entirely. The final week was a nightmare of sleepless nights and increasing paranoia. The voices were now speaking directly to me, though still in their strange language. But I understood them perfectly, as if the meaning was being transmitted directly into my mind rather than through my ears. They told me things about the ocean that weren't in any scientific literature, described phenomena occurring in the deep Arctic waters that wouldn't be discovered by researchers for decades. They spoke about the ice itself as if it were a living entity, something that had been growing and spreading across the Arctic for purposes that human science couldn't comprehend. On my last night at the station, they made me an offer. They invited me to join them, to come down into the ice where I could learn truths about the ocean that no surface-dwelling human had ever discovered. All I had to do was drill one more hole, a deeper hole, and step into it. They promised that the ice would welcome me, that I would survive the transition and become part of something greater than individual human consciousness. For a moment, standing there in the Arctic darkness with my drill in my hands, I actually considered it. The isolation, the constant voices, the growing understanding that I was in the presence of something beyond normal human experience. It all made their offer seem reasonable, almost appealing. But as dawn approached and the voices began to fade, rational thought returned. I packed my equipment as quickly as possible and called for an emergency pickup. The helicopter arrived 6 hours later, and I've never been happier to see another human being in my life. I told them I had completed my research early and needed to return due to equipment problems. They didn't question it. I still have the recordings. Hours and hours of conversations in a language that doesn't exist, discussing topics that shouldn't be possible to know. I've played them for linguists, acoustics experts, and other marine biologists. No one can explain them. The official report of my research trip mentions the ice thickness data and water samples, but nothing about the voices. I finished my degree and now work in warmer waters, studying coral reefs and tropical marine ecosystems. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear them. Not as clearly as when I was on the ice. But they're there, whispering just at the edge of perception. They're still talking about me, still discussing things I'm doing and places I'm going. And sometimes I catch myself listening for that deeper voice, the one that made me the offer. Because part of me, the part that experienced something impossible in the Arctic darkness, still wonders what I would have learned if I had accepted their invitation to join them beneath the ice. My name is Kingston, and I've been fishing the Aleutian waters for 32 years. Started when I was 20, working deck on other men's boats, learning the trade from captains who'd been pulling king crab and halibut from these waters since before Alaska was even a state. By the time I turned 35, I had my own vessel, a 60-foot steel-hulled boat I named the Tender Mercy after my late wife's favorite hymn. For 17 years, that boat was my livelihood, my home, and my sanctuary. She handled every storm the Bering Sea threw at us, brought me through ice floes that would have crushed lesser vessels, and never once let me down. Until November 2019. When something in those waters decided to test both our limits. The fishing had been good that season. We were running a crew of 5, pulling in decent numbers of apilio crab despite the late-season storms that had been hammering the area for weeks. The Weather Service kept warning about a massive low-pressure system moving in from the northwest. But we'd weathered worse, and the crab were running thick. You don't leave good fishing just because the weather looks threatening. That's not how you make a living in these waters. We figured we had maybe 18 hours before the storm hit, enough time to pull our remaining pots and head for Dutch Harbor to wait it out. That last morning started normal enough. Seas were running 8 to 10 feet, nothing unusual for November in the Aleutians. Visibility was decent, maybe 3 miles in the gray light that passes for dawn that time of year. We had 12 pots left to pull, scattered across about 4 square miles of fishing ground that I'd been working for the better part of 15 years. I knew every rock, every depth change, every current in that area. My sonar painted the bottom like a detailed map, showing the underwater ridges and valleys where crab like to congregate. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The first sign something was wrong came when we hauled the sixth pot. Tommy, my deck boss, called out that the pot was heavier than it should be. These were 700-pound steel crab pots, and when they're full of crab, they might weigh close to a ton coming out of the water. But this pot felt like it weighed twice that much, and when it broke the surface, we could see why. The entire pot was covered in some kind of marine growth I'd never seen before. Thick, ropey strands of what looked like seaweed, but colored deep red instead of the normal brown or green. The stuff was wrapped around every bar of the pot so densely that we couldn't even see inside to count the crab. We tried to shake the growth off, but it clung to the metal like it was glued there. When Danny, my youngest crew member, reached out to pull some of it away by hand, I stopped him. Something about the way it moved in the water didn't look natural. It wasn't flowing with the current like normal seaweed would. It was writhing, almost like it was trying to reach toward the boat. We ended up cutting most of it away with knives, and what we found inside the pot was disturbing. The crab were there, but they were all dead, and they'd been dead for a while. Not the kind of dead you get from being out of water too long, but something else. They looked almost drained, like something had sucked all the moisture out of their shells. The next 3 pots we pulled were the same, covered in that red growth, full of dead crab. By the time we got to the 10th pot, the stuff was so thick we could barely get the pot to the surface. The hydraulic winch was straining, the engine was working harder than it should have been, and the boat was listing slightly to starboard from the weight. That's when Marcus, my engineer, came up from below and told me the sonar was acting up. He said it was showing things on the bottom that hadn't been there before, large masses that seemed to be moving around underneath us. I went to look at the sonar display myself, and what I saw made no sense. The bottom, which should have shown the familiar rocky terrain I'd been fishing over for years, now displayed massive shapes clustered directly beneath our position. They were huge. Some of them looked to be the size of school buses, and they were definitely moving. As I watched, one of the shapes detached itself from the group and began rising toward us. The depth sounders showed it coming up fast, much faster than any fish or marine mammal should be able to move. I told the crew to secure everything and prepare to move to a different location. But before we could get the boat moving, something hit us from below. Not a hard collision, but more like something large and soft bumping against the hull. The impact was strong enough to rock the boat and knock Tommy off his feet. But there was no sound of metal striking metal. It felt organic, like being nudged by something massive and alive. The hull-mounted sonar showed whatever had hit us was still there, pressed against the bottom of the boat, extending at least 30 feet in both directions from our keel. That's when things got really strange. The radio started picking up sounds, not voices or normal marine radio chatter, but something that sounded almost musical. Long, low tones that seemed to harmonize with each other, rising and falling in patterns that were definitely not natural, but also not quite mechanical. The sounds were coming from multiple directions, as if we were surrounded by whatever was making them. When I tried to call the Coast Guard on the emergency frequency, my transmission was completely overwhelmed by these tones. We couldn't send or receive any communications. The thing beneath us stayed there for almost an hour, occasionally shifting position but never fully moving away. During that time, more shapes appeared on the sonar, rising from the depths and taking positions around our boat. We were surrounded by at least a dozen massive forms, all of them maintaining the same distance from us, all of them moving in slow, coordinated patterns. The red growth that had been covering our crab pots began appearing in the water around the boat, floating up from below in thick mats that gradually formed a rough circle around us. Marcus came up from the engine room looking pale and shaky. He said the engine was running fine, but something was interfering with our propulsion. The propeller was turning normally, but we weren't moving forward. It was like the water around us had become thick as molasses, preventing any forward motion. We were trapped in the center of this circle of red growth, surrounded by things our sonar could detect, but our eyes couldn't see, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist, coming from creatures that shouldn't be there. The temperature started dropping, not just the air temperature, but the water temperature too. Ice began forming on our rigging despite the fact that it was nowhere near cold enough for that to happen naturally. The ice wasn't normal either. It was tinted with the same deep red color as the marine growth, and it seemed to be forming in specific patterns across our equipment. Within 20 minutes, our entire boat was covered in this red ice, and the weight of it was making us ride lower in the water. That's when I realized we were being pulled down. Not quickly, but steadily and deliberately. The waterline was rising up the sides of our hull, and no amount of pumping could keep the water level down. We weren't taking on water through any breach in the hull. The water was somehow being forced up through our bilge system despite the pumps running at full capacity. Whatever was beneath us wasn't just holding us in place, it was actively trying to drag us under the surface. I made the decision to abandon ship. We launched our life raft that managed to get clear of the boat just as the red ice reached the wheelhouse windows. The tender Mercy went down slowly, almost gently, as if she was being carefully lowered rather than sunk. As she disappeared beneath the surface, the musical tones grew louder and more complex, like whatever was making them was celebrating or communicating with others of its kind. The red growth in the water began to disperse, and the shapes on our portable sonar unit started moving away in different directions. We were picked up 6 hours later by a Coast Guard cutter responding to our emergency beacon. By the time they reached our position, there was no trace of the tender Mercy, no debris field, no oil slick, nothing to indicate that a 60-foot fishing vessel had just been lost. The water temperature was normal. There was no unusual marine growth. And when they deployed their own sonar to search for the wreck, they found nothing but the normal rocky bottom I'd been familiar with for years. The official report listed the cause as catastrophic structural failure due to storm conditions, even though the weather was actually improving when we went down. The insurance company paid out without question, probably because they figured it was just another fishing vessel lost to the notorious Alaskan weather. But I know what happened out there. Something in those waters decided to take my boat, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it. I haven't been fishing since. I sold my permits, moved to Anchorage, and now I work security at the airport. It's steady work indoors, and most importantly, it keeps me on dry land. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear those musical tones. Not as clearly as when we were surrounded by whatever was making them, but they're there, calling from somewhere far below. And sometimes I wonder if the tender Mercy is still down there too, trapped in some underwater place where the normal rules don't apply, with whatever took her still using those sounds to communicate with others of its kind about what they found on the surface that November day. My name is Maria, and I'm 34 years old. 2 years ago, I was working as a maintenance technician on one of the oil platforms in Prudhoe Bay. It was my first winter assignment in Alaska, and I thought I was prepared for the isolation and the constant darkness. I had worked offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico for 6 years, so I understood the rhythm of industrial operations and the challenges of living in a confined space with the same group of people for weeks at a time. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what happened during those 3 months on the ice platform. The North Star platform was a massive structure built on artificial islands connected to the mainland by ice roads that were only passable during the coldest months. During winter operations, we maintained a crew of about 40 people working rotating 12-hour shifts to keep the drilling and extraction equipment running around the clock. The platform was essentially a small industrial city sitting on frozen ground, surrounded by hundreds of miles of Arctic tundra that looked exactly the same in every direction. When I arrived in early December, the sun had already set for the winter and wouldn't rise again until late January. We lived and worked entirely under artificial light. The crew was divided into day shift and night shift, and I was assigned to nights because of my maintenance experience. Night shift ran from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and our job was to handle any equipment problems that arose during the drilling operations, perform routine maintenance on the machinery, and keep all the life support systems running. It was demanding work, but I enjoyed the technical challenges and the fact that night shift generally dealt with fewer supervisors and less bureaucratic interference. The night crew was smaller too. Only about 15 people compared to the 25 on day shift. For the first month, everything ran smoothly. The night shift crew was experienced and professional. There was Jake, the drill supervisor who'd been working Arctic platforms for 12 years. Sarah handled communications and monitored the computer systems. Tommy and Marcus ran the power plant that kept everything operational. We had a medic named David, a cook named Patricia, who kept coffee and food available for the night crew, and several other technicians and operators who knew their jobs well. We developed a good working rhythm, and despite the harsh conditions and constant darkness, morale was generally high. The problem started in early January, right around the time the sun should have been coming back, but wasn't yet visible above the horizon. I began noticing that some of the night shift workers were behaving differently. It started with small things. People not responding when you spoke to them, staring off into space for long periods, or giving answers that didn't quite match the questions you'd asked. At first, I thought it was just cabin fever or seasonal depression. Working in total darkness for weeks can affect people in strange ways, and I figured they were just having trouble adjusting to the conditions. But the behavior became more pronounced and more coordinated. During our shift briefings, I noticed that Jake, Sarah, and Tommy would sometimes finish each other's sentences in ways that seemed too precise to be coincidental. They would nod at the same time, laugh at the same moments, and occasionally all three would turn to look at something that I couldn't see. When I asked them about it directly, they would look confused and claim they hadn't noticed anything unusual. But I was watching them carefully now, and their movements were becoming increasingly synchronized. By the middle of January, nearly half the night shift crew was exhibiting this strange behavior. They would move through their work routines with mechanical precision, rarely speaking unless directly asked a question. And their responses were always brief and somehow vacant. During break times, they would gather in small groups and stand silently together, not talking but clearly communicating something through glances and subtle gestures. When day shift personnel came to relieve us in the morning, the affected crew members would return to normal behavior, chatting and joking as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. The most disturbing part was that they were becoming more efficient at their jobs. Equipment problems that normally took hours to diagnose and repair were being fixed in minutes. Routine maintenance tasks that required multiple people were being completed by single individuals in half the usual time. The drilling operations ran smoother during night shift than they ever had during day shift, and the production numbers were exceeding all expectations. Management was thrilled with our performance, but I was becoming increasingly frightened by what I was witnessing. I started staying awake during my off hours to observe the night shift crew more carefully. What I discovered made me question my own sanity. During the deepest part of the night, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., The affected crew members would gather in the lower levels of the platform, areas that were normally restricted to essential personnel only. They would stand in perfect circles, completely motionless, for hours at a time. I followed them once, staying far enough back to avoid detection, and watched from a maintenance corridor as 12 people stood in absolute silence in one of the pump rooms. They weren't sleeping or meditating. Their eyes were open, and they were clearly aware of their surroundings. But they were completely still, not even breathing in any pattern I could detect. The strangest part was the sound, or rather the lack of sound. These pump rooms were normally filled with the constant noise of machinery, electric motors, hydraulic pumps, ventilation fans. But while the night crew was gathered there, all the mechanical sounds would fade to almost nothing, creating an unnatural quiet that made my ears ring. The machinery was still running, but somehow the noise was being dampened or absorbed by their presence. I tried to document what I was seeing, taking photos and videos with my phone, but the images never came out right. The camera would focus properly and the lighting seemed adequate. But when I reviewed the footage, it showed only empty rooms and normal equipment operations. There was no trace of the gathered crew members or the strange silence I had witnessed. Even when I knew they were standing right in front of the camera, the recordings showed nothing unusual. I began to doubt my own perceptions and wondered if the isolation and darkness were affecting my mental state. But the changes in the crew were becoming impossible to ignore. They moved with perfect coordination now, anticipating each other's actions and completing complex tasks without any verbal communication. During equipment emergencies, they would respond as a single unit, each person performing their role with mechanical precision while maintaining complete silence. They never made mistakes, never showed fatigue, and never seemed to experience any of the normal frustrations or satisfactions that come with challenging technical work. The breaking point came during my 8th week on the platform. I was working alone in one of the generator rooms when the lights went out. This wasn't unusual. Power fluctuations were common during extreme weather. But what happened next terrified me more than anything I had experienced in my life. In the complete darkness, I could hear the night shift crew moving through the platform. But they weren't using flashlights or emergency lighting, and they weren't making the stumbling, careful movements you would expect from people navigating in the dark. They were moving with the same fluid coordination they showed during normal operations, as if the darkness didn't affect them at all. I stayed hidden in the generator room and listened as they passed by outside. Their footsteps were perfectly synchronized, like a military unit marching in formation. But there were too many footsteps for the number of people I knew were on night shift. And the sound seemed to be coming from multiple levels of the platform simultaneously. When the emergency lighting finally came back on 15 minutes later, I found that several pieces of major equipment had been serviced and repaired during the blackout. Work that should have taken hours and required detailed technical manuals to complete properly. That's when I realized they didn't need light to see, didn't need to communicate to coordinate their actions, and didn't need instruction manuals to perform complex technical procedures. Whatever was happening to the night shift crew had given them capabilities that weren't remotely human. I submitted a request for immediate transfer off the platform, claiming a family emergency, and left Alaska 3 days later. The official records show that I completed my contract successfully and left with positive performance reviews. I've tried to research what happened to that platform and that crew, but information about Arctic oil operations is tightly controlled, and most of it is classified for security reasons. I do know that the North Star platform continued to exceed production targets for the rest of that winter season, and that several crew members from that assignment received commendations for exceptional performance. But I also know that at least 3 of the people I worked with that winter have since disappeared completely. No forwarding addresses, no employment records, no social media presence, nothing to indicate where they went or what happened to them. I work on shore now, in refineries and chemical plants, where I can go home to my own bed every night, and there's always sunlight during at least part of the day. But sometimes, usually during the darkest part of winter nights, I find myself moving through my work routines with the same mechanical precision I witnessed on that platform. My efficiency increases, my mind becomes perfectly clear and focused, and I complete tasks without any conscious thought or effort. During these episodes, I feel connected to something vast and purposeful, something that extends far beyond individual human consciousness. And part of me, the part that experienced those 3 months in the Arctic darkness, knows that whatever changed those night shift workers is still out there, still operating in the places where human civilization meets the endless cold, still recruiting new members for purposes I can't begin to understand. My name is Judah, and I've been guiding people through Alaska's wilderness for 23 years. I'm native Alaskan, Koyukon, and I grew up listening to my grandfather's stories about the things that live in the deep forest, the things that most people dismiss as folklore, but that we've always known were real. My grandfather taught me to read the land, to understand the signs that animals leave behind, and to recognize when something doesn't belong in the natural order. He also taught me that there are places in Alaska where even experienced hunters shouldn't go, and things in the wilderness that are better left undisturbed. I wish I had listened more carefully to those warnings. In August 2021, I was hired to guide a family from Oregon through a 5-day backcountry hiking trip in Denali National Park. The Hendersons were experienced hikers. The father had climbed mountains all over the western United States. The mother was a wilderness survival instructor, and their 2 teenage sons had been backpacking since they were children. They weren't the typical tourists I usually dealt with, and they had specifically requested a route that would take them away from the established trails and into areas where they were unlikely to encounter other people. They wanted a genuine wilderness experience, and I was confident I could provide that safely. We started from the Teclanica River area and planned to hike northeast into the foothills below Mount McKinley, following caribou trails and old mining tracks that most visitors to the park never see. It was late summer, which meant we had about 16 hours of daylight and the weather was generally stable. The mosquitoes were terrible, but that's normal for that time of year. Wildlife activity was high because animals were preparing for winter, so we expected to see caribou, possibly some bears, and maybe wolves if we were lucky. Everything about the trip seemed routine for the first 2 days. We made good time through the initial terrain, covering about 12 miles on the first day, and setting up camp near a small lake that provided good water and protection from the wind. The family was in excellent physical condition and handled the challenging terrain without any problems. That evening, we saw a large caribou herd moving through the valley below us, and I pointed out some Dall's sheep on the distant ridges. The boys were excited by the wildlife sightings, and everyone was in good spirits. The only unusual thing I noticed was that the birds were quieter than normal, but I attributed that to the presence of a large predator in the area, probably a bear or wolf pack. The second day took us higher into the hills, following a route that I had used many times before. The terrain became more challenging, with loose scree slopes and dense patches of alder brush. But the family handled it well. We stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook where we could see for miles across the tundra, and I used the opportunity to scan the surrounding area with binoculars for signs of wildlife. That's when I first noticed the tracks. They were in a muddy area near a small stream, and at first glance they looked like wolf tracks. But something about them wasn't right. The prints were too large for any wolf I had ever seen, probably 8 inches long and 6 inches wide, with claw marks that extended much farther from the toe pads than they should have. The depth of the impressions suggested an animal that weighed considerably more than even the largest Alaskan wolves, which typically max out around 140 pounds. These tracks indicated something that might weigh twice that much. The stride length was also wrong. The distance between prints suggested an animal with much longer legs than any wolf or dog I was familiar with. But the most disturbing aspect was how fresh the tracks were. Based on the condition of the mud and the clarity of the impressions, whatever had made them had passed through that area within the last few hours. I didn't mention the tracks to the Henderson family because I didn't want to cause unnecessary alarm, but I started paying much closer attention to our surroundings. Over the next few hours, I found more signs of the same animal. Scratches on trees that were too high for any normal predator to reach. Scat that contained bone fragments from animals much larger than anything wolves typically kill. And a distinctive musky scent that I had never encountered before. Whatever was in this area was something I had never seen in over 2 decades of guiding in Alaska. That evening, we camped in a sheltered valley with good visibility in all directions. I set up my tent where I could watch the approaches to our campsite, and I kept my rifle close at hand. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds that made my blood run cold. It was howling, but not like any wolf or dog I had ever heard. The sound was deeper, more resonant, and it had an almost musical quality that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The calls would start low and rise to a piercing crescendo, then fade away into silence before beginning again from a different location. The Henderson family woke up too, and the father asked me if those were wolves. I told him I thought they might be, but I knew they weren't. Whatever was making those sounds was much larger than any wolf, and the vocal patterns were completely wrong. Wolves howl to communicate with their pack, but these calls sounded more like territorial challenges or hunting signals. They were also getting closer. Each series of howls seemed to originate from a position nearer to our campsite, as if whatever was making them was systematically moving around our perimeter. The calls continued for about 2 hours, during which none of us got any sleep. I kept scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but I never saw anything beyond the circle of our camp. When dawn finally broke, I found tracks all around our campsite, the same oversized prints I had discovered the previous day. Whatever had been calling to us during the night had come very close, probably within 30 feet of our tents, but it had remained just beyond the reach of our lights. The tracks showed that it had circled our camp multiple times, stopping at various points as if studying our setup and counting the number of people. I made the decision to alter our planned route and head toward a more populated area of the park. But our stalker had different ideas. Throughout the 3rd day, we found evidence that we were being followed. Fresh tracks appeared regularly along our trail, always just ahead of us, as if something was scouting our progress and choosing the best vantage points from which to observe us. Several times, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark shifting position among the trees or behind rock outcroppings. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The psychological pressure on the group was becoming intense. The boys were asking questions about the tracks and the sounds we had heard, and their parents were obviously concerned, but trying not to show it. I was running out of rational explanations, and my own anxiety was increasing with each new sign we discovered. The worst part was the feeling of being watched constantly. Every time we stopped to rest or eat, I could sense something observing us from the surrounding terrain, studying our behavior and waiting for the right moment to act. On the afternoon of the third day, we crested a ridge and found ourselves looking down at a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my life. In the valley below us, scattered across an area of about 2 acres, were the remains of a caribou herd. But these weren't normal predator kills. The animals had been torn apart with a violence and precision that no known Alaskan predator could achieve. Some of the caribou had been completely dismembered, their legs and heads separated from their bodies and arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Others had been opened up and emptied out, their internal organs removed with surgical precision and nowhere to be found. The kill site was fresh, some of the blood was still wet, and the smell of death was overwhelming. But what terrified me most was the absence of scavengers. In normal circumstances, a kill site this large would be swarming with ravens, eagles, foxes, and other animals taking advantage of the free meal. Instead, the area was completely deserted. Even the insects that usually accompany death scenes were absent. It was as if every living creature in the vicinity knew to stay away from whatever had created this carnage. I counted at least 40 caribou carcasses, representing almost an entire herd. The amount of killing was far beyond what any predator would need for food, and the systematic nature of the destruction suggested intelligence and purpose rather than simple hunger. This wasn't the work of wolves or bears or any other natural predator. This was something else entirely, something that killed for reasons I couldn't understand, and with capabilities that exceeded anything in my experience. We left the area immediately, abandoning our planned campsite and hiking until well after dark to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that valley of death. I called for an emergency pickup by helicopter, claiming that one of the family members was experiencing altitude sickness and needed immediate medical attention. The helicopter arrived the next morning and extracted us from a meadow about 15 miles from the kill site. I filed a report with the Park Service about the caribou kills, but when rangers investigated the area a week later, they found no evidence of any unusual predator activity. The carcasses were gone, the blood had been washed away by rain, and the ground showed no signs of the massive slaughter I had witnessed. The official explanation was that I had probably stumbled across the site of an avalanche or rock slide that had killed some caribou, and that scavengers had already cleaned up the remains. But I know what I saw, and I know what stalked us through those mountains. My grandfather's stories talked about creatures that lived in the deepest wilderness, things that were neither fully animal nor fully something else. Beings that existed on the edges of the natural world and occasionally crossed over into our reality. He called them the Adlet. Creatures that hunted with intelligence and purpose, that could take forms that resembled natural animals but were something far more dangerous. I've stopped guiding in the backcountry areas of Denali. I still work as a guide, but now I stick to the established trails and popular camping areas where there are always other people around. Because I learned that there are still places in Alaska where ancient things hunt according to rules we don't understand, and where even experienced outdoorsmen can become prey for creatures that exist in the spaces between what we consider possible and what we know is real. My name is Emery, and I am a USGS surveyor. For over 18 years, I have spent my career mapping and studying some of the most remote and challenging wilderness areas in North America. I've worked in the Rockies, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevada. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered in Alaska's Brooks Range. It's a region where maps end and the unknown begins, where the landscape itself seems to resist human understanding. In July 2020, during what was supposed to be a routine solo mapping expedition, I discovered that some places on Earth operate by rules that our instruments and our minds simply cannot comprehend. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. The USGS had identified a section of the Northern Brooks Range where our existing maps were either incomplete or based on outdated survey data from the 1950s. Modern GPS technology and satellite imagery had revealed discrepancies in the old charts, and my job was to conduct a ground survey to verify the actual topography. The area covered roughly 60 square miles of mountainous terrain, including several unnamed peaks, glacial valleys, and a network of streams that fed into larger river systems. I had conducted dozens of similar surveys throughout my career, and this one appeared no more challenging than any other remote wilderness mapping project. I flew into the area by bush plane, landing on a gravel bar alongside a braided river that served as my base camp. The pilot who dropped me off mentioned that the weather in that region could change rapidly, and that radio communication was often unreliable due to the surrounding peaks. He promised to return in 10 days to extract me, weather permitting. As his plane disappeared over the mountains, I felt the familiar combination of excitement and solitude that comes with beginning a solo expedition into truly remote country. I had enough supplies for 2 weeks: professional-grade GPS equipment, topographic software, and all the standard gear for wilderness survival. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. I established my survey routes, began taking GPS readings at predetermined intervals, and started building a detailed picture of the actual terrain. The landscape was spectacular. Jagged peaks rising above tree line, pristine alpine lakes, and vast expanses of tundra that stretched toward the horizon. Wildlife was abundant, with caribou, Dall sheep, and various bird species providing constant reminders that this was one of the last truly wild places in North America. My equipment functioned perfectly, the weather remained stable, and I was making excellent progress on my survey objectives. The problems began on the third morning when I attempted to return to a reference point I had established the previous day. According to my GPS, I was following the correct route and should have reached the landmark within 2 hours. But after hiking for nearly 4 hours in what my instruments indicated was the right direction, I found myself in terrain that didn't match my notes or photographs from the previous day. Where I expected to find a distinctive rock formation that I had used as a survey marker, I instead discovered a deep valley that hadn't been there before. The GPS insisted I was in the correct location, but the physical evidence of my eyes contradicted the electronic data completely. Initially, I assumed I'd made a navigation error or that my GPS had malfunctioned. I rechecked my coordinates, verified my waypoints, and even switched to my backup GPS unit. Both devices showed identical readings and indicated that I was exactly where I intended to be. But the landscape around me bore no resemblance to the area I had surveyed the previous day. The rock formation I had photographed and marked was simply gone, replaced by features that didn't appear on any of my maps or in any of my previous observations. It was as if the terrain had rearranged itself overnight. Over the next several hours, I attempted to reorient myself by hiking to other known reference points. Each time, I encountered the same problem. My GPS indicated I was in the correct location, but the actual topography didn't match my expectations or my previous surveys. Valleys appeared where my instruments showed ridgelines. Lakes existed where my maps indicated solid ground. Most disturbing of all, I began to notice that I was somehow returning to the same locations repeatedly, despite following different compass bearings and GPS routes. No matter which direction I traveled, I would inevitably arrive at a peculiar circular clearing surrounded by stunted spruce trees. A formation that wasn't marked on any map, and that I couldn't remember encountering during my initial surveys. By the 5th day, I was completely disoriented and beginning to question my own sanity. The landscape around me seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. I would mark a prominent landmark, a distinctive peak, or an unusual rock outcropping, and use it for navigation, only to discover hours later that it had moved to a different position relative to my location. My GPS readings became increasingly erratic, sometimes placing me hundreds of miles from where I knew I had to be. Other times showing coordinates that corresponded to locations in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. The topographic software on my laptop began displaying impossible terrain features. Valleys that folded back on themselves, rivers that flowed uphill, and mountain ranges that formed perfect geometric patterns. The psychological impact was devastating. As a professional surveyor, my entire career was built on precision, accuracy, and the reliable relationship between instruments and reality. But in this place, those fundamental assumptions were breaking down completely. I couldn't trust my equipment, couldn't rely on my training, and couldn't even depend on my own observations to provide consistent information about my surroundings. The very concept of location, something so basic that most people never question it, became meaningless. I existed in a space where the normal rules of geography and navigation simply didn't apply. Sleep became almost impossible. During the brief periods when I managed to rest, I would dream of endless mazes formed by mountain peaks and valleys that rearranged themselves as I moved through them. I would wake up convinced that my tent had been moved during the night, even though I always secured it carefully and left markers to verify its position. Several times, I discovered that my equipment had been rearranged in ways that I couldn't explain. GPS units showing impossible readings, compasses pointing in directions that changed as I watched them, and topographic maps that displayed features I had never seen before. On the 7th day, I encountered something that shattered my remaining faith in rational explanation. While attempting to climb a ridge that should have provided a clear view of the surrounding area, I reached what appeared to be the summit, only to discover that I was looking down into a valley I had hiked through earlier that same morning. But according to my GPS, I was standing at an elevation of over 8,000 feet, while the valley below showed an elevation reading of nearly 9,000 feet. I was apparently standing on a mountaintop that was lower than the valley beneath it. When I attempted to descend into this impossible valley, I found myself climbing upward despite the visual evidence that I was moving downhill. The realization that I was trapped in some kind of geographical anomaly was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Once I accepted that the normal laws of physics and geography weren't operating in this region, I could stop trying to navigate using conventional methods and focus instead on finding a way to escape whatever phenomenon had captured me. I began to notice patterns in the impossible terrain, certain landmarks that appeared repeatedly, routes that seemed to lead in loops regardless of the compass direction I followed, and boundaries where the strange effects appeared to be stronger or weaker. Through careful experimentation, I discovered that the anomalies were most pronounced in certain areas and at certain times of day. The effects seemed to intensify during the early morning hours and diminish slightly around midday. By avoiding the most severely affected zones and timing my movements to coincide with periods of relative stability, I was eventually able to work my way toward what I hoped was the edge of the phenomenon. The process took 3 additional days of careful observation and methodical testing, during which I documented everything I experienced in detailed notes that I hoped someone would eventually find and understand. On the 10th day, exactly when my extraction was scheduled, I heard the sound of an aircraft approaching from the south. Using my emergency radio, I was able to establish contact with the pilot and guide him to a landing site near my original base camp. When I reached the gravel bar where he waited, I was amazed to discover that it looked exactly as it had when he had dropped me off 10 days earlier. The landmarks I remembered were in their proper positions. My cached supplies were undisturbed, and my GPS showed normal, consistent readings for the first time in a week. During the flight out, I attempted to describe my experiences to the pilot, but he seemed skeptical and suggested that the isolation and high altitude might have affected my judgment. When I submitted my official report to the USGS, I included only the standard topographic data and made no mention of the geographical anomalies I had encountered. The maps I produced were based on my observations from the first 2 days before the strange effects began, and they matched reasonably well with the existing survey data. To anyone reviewing my work, it would appear that I had conducted a routine and successful mapping expedition. But I kept my personal notes from those impossible 7 days, and I've studied them extensively in the years since my return. The documentation is thorough and consistent, recorded by someone who was trained to observe and measure precisely. I wasn't hallucinating or suffering from altitude sickness or psychological breakdown. I encountered a region where the fundamental nature of space and geography operates according to principles that our current scientific understanding cannot explain. The Brooks Range contains places where the normal relationship between position and landscape breaks down completely, where skilled navigators can become hopelessly lost despite perfect equipment and clear weather. I've never returned to Alaska, and I've never discussed my experiences with my colleagues at the USGS. I transferred to a position mapping urban areas and developed transportation infrastructure. Work that keeps me in well-surveyed regions where the locations of roads and buildings remain consistent from day to day. But I still maintain my professional certifications and continue to study advances in surveying technology, hoping that someday our instruments will become sophisticated enough to detect and measure the phenomena I encountered in that unmapped region of the Brooks Range. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing topographic data or calibrating GPS equipment, I remember the feeling of standing on that impossible mountaintop and looking down into a valley that existed at a higher elevation than my position. I remember the terror and wonder of discovering that reality itself could be far stranger and more flexible than anything I had learned in my professional training. And I remember the certainty that there are places on Earth that resist human understanding, locations where our maps will always be incomplete because the very concept of fixed geography doesn't apply. The Brooks Range holds secrets that go far beyond mineral deposits and wildlife populations. Hidden in its most remote valleys and peaks are zones where space itself behaves according to rules we haven't discovered yet, where experienced surveyors can become lost in landscapes that rearrange themselves according to some incomprehensible logic. I documented one small piece of that mystery, but I suspect it extends far beyond the region I explored, threading through Alaska's wilderness in patterns that connect to something much larger and more profound than any of us realize. My name is Antonio, and I've been a bush pilot for 12 years now. Flying in and out of Alaska's most remote locations has become second nature to me. Dropping off supplies, transporting researchers, evacuating injured hunters, and connecting isolated communities to the outside world. I've seen some of the most spectacular and dangerous terrain on Earth, landed on strips of gravel that most people would consider impossible, and weathered storms that would ground commercial aviation for days. But there's one route I used to fly regularly that I won't touch anymore. And it all started with an old man living alone in the Tongass National Forest near Ketchikan. The locals called him simply the Hermit, and for good reason. He lived in a cabin that could only be reached by seaplane. floating on a remote alpine lake surrounded by dense forest and towering mountains. I'd been delivering supplies to him monthly for almost 3 years. Canned goods, tools, fuel, medicine, books, and other essentials that kept him surviving in complete isolation. The arrangement was straightforward. Drop off the supplies, collect payment, and leave. He rarely spoke more than a few words, never invited me inside, and maintained the kind of distance that suggested he'd chosen isolation for very deliberate reasons. What made the locals nervous wasn't just his hermit lifestyle. Alaska has plenty of people who prefer solitude, but the stories that surrounded him. Other pilots mentioned strange experiences when flying to his cabin. Hunters reported seeing lights in the forest near his lake that moved in patterns unlike any natural phenomenon. A few fishing guides claimed they'd encountered him in town occasionally, and he always seemed to know things about them that he shouldn't. Personal details about their families, their health problems, their plans for the future. Most disturbing were the reports from people who said he'd given them warnings about events that hadn't happened yet. Warnings that later proved to be accurate. I dismissed most of these stories as typical small-town gossip, amplified by the inherent mystery of a man who'd chosen to live completely cut off from society. Alaska attracts people who are running from something or looking for something they can't find in the outside world. And I figured the hermit was just another example of someone who'd taken the solitude option to its logical extreme. The strange stories were probably just the result of people projecting their own fears and fantasies onto someone they didn't understand. That assumption lasted until my 4th year of monthly supply runs, when something happened that shattered my comfortable skepticism completely. I landed on his lake on a clear September afternoon, the water reflecting the autumn colors of the surrounding forest like a perfect mirror. The hermit met me at the dock as usual, but this time something was different. Instead of his typical nod and brief greeting, he studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "You're worried about your sister," he said. It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made my blood run cold. I hadn't mentioned my sister to anyone in Alaska, and there was no way he could have known about her recent cancer diagnosis or the surgery she was scheduled for the following week. When I asked him how he knew, he just shook his head and began unloading the supplies from my plane. But as he worked, he continued talking, and what he said made no rational sense. He told me about a storm that would ground me for 3 days the following month, describing the exact location where I'd be forced to land and the mechanical problem that would keep me there. He mentioned a family I'd never met who would hire me to evacuate their injured son from a hunting camp, providing details about the accident that wouldn't happen for another 2 months. Most unsettling of all, he warned me about changes that were coming to the region, developments that would alter the character of the wilderness in ways that would disturb anyone who truly loved Alaska's pristine remoteness. Over the next 6 months, every single one of his predictions came true with frightening accuracy. The storm hit exactly when and where he said it would, grounding me at a remote airstrip for 3 days while I waited for parts to repair a fuel line that had cracked in precisely the way he'd described. The hunting accident occurred on the exact date he'd specified, and I found myself flying an injured teenager to the hospital in Ketchikan under circumstances that matched his description perfectly. The development projects he'd warned about were announced by the state government, threatening some of the last truly wild areas in southeastern Alaska. I started paying closer attention to our brief conversations during my monthly supply runs, and I began to realize that the hermit wasn't just making lucky guesses or reading subtle clues from my behavior. He possessed knowledge that extended far beyond what any isolated individual should be able to access. He knew about weather patterns weeks in advance, could predict equipment failures before they occurred, and seemed to have insight into the personal lives and future plans of people he'd never met. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him directly how he knew these things, his answer was more disturbing than any explanation I could have imagined. "This land talks to those who know how to listen," he said, gesturing toward the forest surrounding his cabin. "Time moves differently here, flows in directions that don't make sense to people who think in straight lines. I've been listening for 43 years, and I've learned that some knowledge comes with a price. You can see what's coming, but you can't always prevent it. You can warn people, but they don't always believe you. And sometimes, knowing the future is a burden too heavy for one person to carry alone." He explained that he'd come to Alaska in the late 1970s as a young geologist, part of a survey team mapping mineral deposits in remote areas of the Tongass. During a solo expedition, he'd encountered something in the deep forest, he wouldn't specify exactly what, that had altered his perception of time and causality. Since then, he'd been able to see threads of possibility extending forward and backward through time, understanding how events connected across years and decades in ways that most people couldn't comprehend. The isolation wasn't just a preference, he said. It was necessary. The knowledge he'd gained came with responsibilities that made normal social relationships impossible. He'd tried returning to civilization initially, but his attempts to warn people about future dangers or disasters had labeled him as unstable or dangerous. Eventually, he'd realized that his role was to serve as a kind of early warning system for the wilderness itself, helping individual travelers avoid specific dangers while documenting the larger patterns that threatened the region's ecological stability. During our conversation, he shared specific warnings about routes I should avoid during certain weather conditions, locations where aircraft had been experiencing unusual mechanical failures, and areas where the normal rules of navigation seemed to break down temporarily. He also gave me information about my personal future that I didn't want to hear. Details about family problems, career challenges, and life changes that would unfold over the coming years. Some of his predictions were encouraging, others were deeply troubling, but all of them carried the weight of absolute certainty. As winter approached, the hermit's warnings became more urgent and more specific. He told me that the lake would freeze earlier than normal, cutting off his supply route for longer than usual. More importantly, he said that something was changing in the wilderness around his cabin, something that would make it dangerous for aircraft to land there during certain lunar phases. He couldn't explain the mechanism, but he was adamant that I should suspend my supply runs until spring and find alternative arrangements for his winter provisions. I made my last supply run to his cabin in early November, carrying enough food and fuel to last him through the long Alaska winter. As I prepared to leave, he handed me a sealed envelope and told me not to open it until the following summer. Inside, he said, were instructions for what to do if he didn't survive the winter. Not because of any immediate danger, but because the isolation and the burden of constant foreknowledge were wearing him down in ways that made his long-term survival uncertain. I never saw the hermit again. When I returned to his lake the following June, the cabin was empty and showed no signs of recent occupation. His personal belongings were gone, but there was no indication of violence or struggle. It was as if he had simply walked into the forest and disappeared. Search and rescue teams found no trace of him, and the official investigation concluded that he had probably suffered an accident while hiking or had chosen to end his isolation by walking out to one of the logging roads and leaving the area entirely. But I opened the envelope he'd given me, and the contents suggested a different explanation. Along with detailed instructions for disposing of his property and personal effects, he'd included a final set of predictions, events that would unfold over the next decade, including specific warnings about natural disasters, economic changes, and environmental threats. At the bottom of the last page, he'd written a single sentence that haunts me still. Some knowledge can only be carried so far before it becomes too heavy for human shoulders. I've never flown back to that lake, and I've never shared the hermit's final predictions with anyone. Some of them have already come true with the same frightening accuracy that characterized all his previous warnings. Others describe events that won't occur for several more years, assuming his gift for seeing the future extended that far into his final isolation. I keep his letter in a safe deposit box in Anchorage, along with my own notes documenting the experiences that convinced me he possessed genuine prophetic abilities. Sometimes, when I'm flying over the Tongass forest on routine supply runs, I find myself scanning the landscape below, wondering if the hermit is still out there somewhere, living even deeper in the wilderness, continuing his solitary watch over a land that speaks to those willing to listen. Part of me hopes he found peace in whatever fate he chose for himself. But another part of me knows that someone who could see as far into the future as he could probably understood exactly what was waiting for him when he walked away from that cabin for the last time. Alaska is full of people seeking solitude, but the hermit was different. He wasn't running from the world. He was serving as a bridge between the world and something larger, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. His warnings saved my life more than once, and I suspect they saved the lives of others who were wise enough to listen. But the price he paid for that knowledge was isolation so complete that it ultimately consumed him, leaving behind only questions about the true nature of time, prophecy, and the wild places that still hold secrets too profound for human understanding. My name is Iris, and I was 22 years old when I moved into a basement apartment in Fairbanks during my senior year at the University of Alaska. I needed something cheap and close to campus, and this place seemed perfect. A furnished basement unit just a 15-minute walk from my classes, available for half the price of most other rentals in town. The landlord was eager to rent it, mentioning that it had been vacant for several months and that I could move in immediately. At the time, I thought I was getting an incredible deal. I had no idea that some bargains come with hidden costs that can't be measured in dollars. The apartment was in an older building, probably constructed in the 1960s when Fairbanks was expanding rapidly due to oil development. The basement had been converted into a living space decades earlier, with thick concrete walls, small rectangular windows set high near the ceiling, and low ceilings that made me feel constantly aware of the weight of the structure above me. The furniture was mismatched, but functional. A fold-out couch, a small dining table, a kitchenette with appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum. Everything was clean when I moved in, but there was a persistent, musty smell that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if moisture and time had created their own unique fragrance that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. The first few nights were uneventful, but I noticed small things that seemed slightly off. The temperature in the apartment never felt quite right. Even with the heater running constantly, there were always cold spots, particularly near the windows and in the corners of the main room. I attributed this to poor insulation and the brutal Fairbanks winter, where temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The building's heating system was old, and basement apartments are notoriously difficult to keep warm. I bought extra blankets and space heaters, thinking that would solve the problem. But as January progressed and the daylight hours shrank to almost nothing, stranger things began happening. I would come home from classes to find my belongings rearranged in subtle ways, books moved from one shelf to another, papers organized differently than I had left them, personal items relocated to places where I was certain I hadn't put them. At first, I thought I was simply forgetting where I had placed things, a common occurrence during the stressful final semester of college. But the incidents became more frequent and more obvious. until I started taking photographs of my apartment before leaving each morning to document exactly how I had left everything. The photographs confirmed that someone or something was moving my possessions while I was away. Not dramatically, no overturned furniture or vandalized property, but with a methodical precision that was somehow more disturbing than random destruction would have been. My textbooks would be restacked in different orders, with bookmarks moved to pages I had never read. Clothes in my dresser drawers would be refolded and arranged by color rather than by type. Kitchen utensils would migrate from one drawer to another, always placed neatly, but never where I had left them. Most unsettling of all, personal photographs that I kept on my bedside table would be turned face down, as if someone didn't want to look at the people in the pictures. I questioned the landlord about who else might have access to the apartment, but he insisted that only he and I had keys, and that he hadn't entered the unit since I moved in. The locks were functioning properly, the windows were too small and too high for anyone to enter from outside, and there was no evidence of forced entry. I even installed a small security camera, but the footage consistently showed my apartment remaining empty while I was at classes, with no indication of how my belongings were being moved. Yet when I returned each evening, something would inevitably be different from how I had left it. The psychological impact was devastating. I became obsessed with documenting the state of my apartment, spending hours each day photographing and cataloging my possessions to prove to myself that the changes were really happening. My academic performance began to suffer as I lost sleep and focus, constantly worrying about what I would find when I returned home. Friends noticed my increasing paranoia and suggested that the stress of senior year and the isolation of living alone in a basement during the darkest months of the Alaska winter might be affecting my perception of reality. But I knew what I was experiencing was real, even if I couldn't explain how it was happening. The incidents escalated during a particularly severe cold snap in February, when temperatures dropped to 55 below zero and stayed there for over a week. The extreme cold seemed to intensify whatever was happening in my apartment. Objects began disappearing entirely rather than simply being moved, only to reappear days later in impossible locations. Inside closed cabinets that I never used, taped to the undersides of furniture, hidden inside the pages of textbooks. The cold spots in the apartment became more pronounced, creating areas where the temperature was noticeably lower than the surrounding space, as if invisible entities were drawing heat from the environment. Most disturbing were the personal items that began accumulating in my apartment, belongings that weren't mine and that I had never seen before. Old-fashioned clothing appeared in my closet, hanging neatly among my modern clothes as if it had always belonged there. Vintage photographs of people I didn't recognize were mixed in with my personal pictures. Outdated textbooks on subjects I wasn't studying appeared on my shelves, some with handwritten notes in the margins dated decades before I was born. The landlord denied any knowledge of previous tenants' belongings being left behind, and insisted that the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned before I moved in. By March, I was documenting not just the movement and appearance of objects, but also sounds that occurred regularly throughout the night. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door, even though I was the only tenant in the basement level. Voices having conversations in languages I couldn't identify, seeming to come from within the walls themselves. The sound of furniture being moved in rooms that didn't exist, as if the apartment had additional spaces that I couldn't access. Most unsettling were the personal conversations I overheard. Discussions about daily activities, work problems, and family relationships that seemed to involve people who weren't there. I began researching the history of the building and discovered that my apartment had been constructed on the site of a boarding house that had operated from the early 1900s through the 1950s, providing housing for miners, construction workers, and other transient laborers who came to Fairbanks during its early development. The boarding house had been destroyed in a fire in 1957, with several residents reported missing and never found. The current building had been constructed on the same foundation, using some of the original basement infrastructure. City records indicated that several previous tenants of my specific apartment had broken their leases early, citing personal reasons or family emergencies, but providing no additional details. Armed with this historical information, I began to understand that the objects appearing in my apartment weren't random accumulations of forgotten belongings. They were personal possessions of people who had lived and died in that space decades earlier. The conversations I heard weren't coming from current neighbors, but from former residents whose presence somehow persisted in the building. The rearrangement of my belongings wasn't malicious vandalism, but the continuation of daily routines by people who didn't realize they were no longer alive. My apartment existed in a space where multiple time periods overlapped, where the past refused to remain in the past. The final incident occurred during the spring thaw in April, when warming temperatures began melting the accumulated snow and ice. I returned from classes to find my apartment filled with the belongings of dozens of people. Suitcases packed with clothing from different decades, personal photographs spanning nearly a century, letters and documents written in multiple languages, tools and equipment from industries that no longer existed in Fairbanks. The accumulation was so extensive that I could barely move through the rooms, as if every person who had ever lived in that space had decided to move back in simultaneously. That night, I packed my essential belongings and moved out permanently, forfeiting my security deposit and breaking my lease without explanation. I spent the remaining months of my senior year sleeping on friends' couches and cramming for final exams while trying to process what I had experienced. I graduated on schedule and left Alaska immediately afterward, taking a job in a warmer climate where basements are rare and buildings don't carry the accumulated weight of decades of human tragedy. I never reported my experiences to the landlord or to university counseling services, knowing that my story would be dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations or the product of seasonal depression. But I kept the photographs and documentation I had gathered, along with copies of the historical research I had conducted. The evidence clearly shows that my apartment served as a kind of temporal intersection, where the boundaries between past and present broke down completely, allowing the memories and possessions of former residents to manifest in the physical world. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly vulnerable or isolated, I can still hear the conversations from that basement apartment, the voices of people discussing their daily concerns and sharing their hopes and fears as if they were still alive. I understand now that some locations accumulate human experience in ways that transcend normal concepts of time and space, creating environments where the living and the dead coexist without clear boundaries. My basement apartment in Fairbanks was one such place, a repository of human memory and emotion that continues to operate according to its own mysterious rules. I've never returned to Fairbanks, and I've never lived in another basement apartment. The experience taught me that some spaces hold more than just furniture and personal belongings. They hold the accumulated energy of everyone who has ever called them home, creating a kind of psychic archaeology where past lives continue to unfold alongside present reality. For 3 months, I shared my living space with the ghosts of Fairbanks' early residents, learning that the boundary between life and death is far more permeable than most people realize, especially in places where human suffering and loss have left permanent impressions on the physical environment. My name is Maxwell, but most people who know me call me Buck. I've been a park ranger for 34 years, with the last 26 of those spent working in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. If you've never been there, It's hard to describe the sheer scale and pristine beauty of the place. 19.6 million acres of untouched wilderness where the Brooks Range meets the Arctic Ocean, where caribou migrate in herds of hundreds of thousands, and where the aurora borealis paints the winter sky in colors that make you question everything you thought you knew about light and darkness. It's a place that changes you, that gets into your blood and makes everywhere else seem small and tame by comparison. But it's also a place that holds secrets. And during my final season as a ranger, I discovered that some of those secrets are more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. The spring thaw of 2019 came early that year, with temperatures rising faster than normal and the permafrost beginning to soften in ways that veteran rangers found concerning. Climate change was affecting the Arctic more rapidly than anywhere else on Earth, and we were seeing changes in wildlife patterns, vegetation growth, and ice formation that were unprecedented in the historical record. As the senior ranger for the eastern sector of the refuge, it was my job to monitor these changes and document any unusual phenomena that might indicate broader ecological shifts. What I found that spring went far beyond climate science and into territory that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I was conducting routine patrols in late April, checking on research camps and monitoring caribou migration routes, when I discovered tracks that stopped me cold. They were in a muddy area near a small lake, pressed deep into the soft ground by something that had passed through recently, probably within the previous 24 hours based on the condition of the impressions. At first glance, I thought they might be bear tracks, but as I knelt down to examine them more closely, I realized they were unlike anything I had ever seen in over 3 decades of wilderness work. The prints were enormous, nearly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with a distinctly humanoid shape that showed 5 separate toe impressions and what appeared to be an arch in the middle of the foot. But what made them truly unsettling were the claw marks. Deep gouges extending 3 to 4 inches beyond each toe that had been pressed into the mud with tremendous force. The stride length was equally disturbing. Measuring between the prints, I found that whatever had made these tracks was taking steps of nearly 5 feet, indicating a creature that stood at least 8 to 9 feet tall and moved with a gait that was neither fully human nor fully animal. The depth of the impressions suggested something that weighed considerably more than even the largest grizzly bears in the region, which typically max out around 800 pounds. These tracks indicated a creature that might weigh twice that much, moving across terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers with apparent ease. Over the next several days, I found more of the same tracks in various locations throughout my patrol area. They appeared near streams, across tundra meadows, and even in areas of dense willow brush where any large creature should have left obvious signs of passage through the vegetation. But there was never any broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, or other evidence of something massive forcing its way through the landscape. Whatever was making these tracks move through the wilderness with a stealth and precision that seemed impossible for something of its apparent size and weight. I documented everything meticulously, taking photographs, measurements, and GPS coordinates for each set of tracks I discovered. I also began mapping the pattern of the creature's movement, trying to understand where it was going and what it might be seeking in this remote corner of the Arctic. What emerged was deeply troubling. The tracks seemed to be systematically approaching and circling the locations of active research camps, always staying just far enough away to avoid direct observation, but close enough to suggest deliberate surveillance of human activities. When I reported my findings to the refugee management and shared the documentation with the research teams currently working in the area, the response was mixed. Some scientists were intrigued by the possibility of discovering an unknown species, while others suggested that the tracks might be the result of known animals moving in unusual patterns due to environmental changes. A few researchers speculated that they might be dealing with individual bears that had been affected by climate change in ways that altered their typical behavior and movement patterns. But none of these explanations accounted for the size, shape, and pattern of the tracks I was finding. The situation took a darker turn during the second week of May, when a research team studying permafrost changes failed to check in for their scheduled radio contact. The team consisted of 3 experienced scientists: Dr. Patricia Miller from the University of Alaska, Dr. James Chen from the Smithsonian Institution, and graduate student Rebecca Torres from Colorado State University. They had been conducting core sampling about 12 miles from the main research station, in an area I had patrolled regularly and where I had found several sets of the mysterious tracks over the previous weeks. I was part of the search and rescue operation that went looking for the missing researchers. We found their campsite intact, with all their equipment, food, and personal belongings undisturbed. Their tents were still properly staked and organized. Research materials were laid out as if they had been working normally, and there was no evidence of any struggle or panic. It was as if they had simply walked away from their camp and vanished into the wilderness without taking any of their survival gear or emergency equipment. Most disturbing of all, we found no human tracks leading away from the campsite in any direction. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that they had left the area on foot. But we did find the creatures' tracks. Large humanoid prints circled the researchers' campsite at a distance of about 50 yards, forming an almost perfect ring around the area where the scientists had been working. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the same time frame as the researchers' disappearance. Following the trail, we discovered that it led away from the campsite and deeper into the wilderness, toward areas of the refuge that were rarely visited by humans, and where the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. The official search continued for over a week, involving helicopter overflights, ground teams with tracking dogs, and coordination with native communities who knew the area better than anyone. We covered hundreds of square miles of tundra and mountain terrain, checking every possible location where the missing researchers might have sought shelter or become trapped by weather or injury. But we found no trace of them. No bodies, no equipment, no signs that they had survived their disappearance or died in any location we could identify. It was as if they had simply been erased from the landscape. During the extended search operation, other rangers and search team members began reporting their own sightings of the mysterious tracks. The prints appeared in locations throughout the eastern sector of the refuge, always with the same enormous size and humanoid characteristics, always seeming to watch and follow human activity from a distance. Several searchers reported feeling observed while conducting their patrols, describing a persistent sense of being watched by something large and intelligent that remained just beyond visual range. On the final day of the official search, I was working alone in a remote valley about 15 miles from where the researchers had disappeared, making one last attempt to find any trace of their fate. Late in the afternoon, as I was preparing to return to base camp, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A sound like nothing I had ever encountered in decades of wilderness work. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, that seemed to come from the ground itself. Then it rose in pitch and volume, becoming a howl or roar that echoed off the surrounding mountains and seemed to last far longer than any sound produced by a living creature should. It was a sound that conveyed intelligence and intention, but also a wildness and power that felt completely alien to anything I understood about the natural world. I never saw the creature that made that sound, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was aware of my presence, and was communicating something. A warning, a challenge, or perhaps just an acknowledgement that our paths had crossed in this remote corner of the world. I left the area immediately and never returned to that particular valley. Even though it contained some of the most pristine and scientifically valuable habitat in the entire refuge. In my final report as a ranger, I documented everything I had experienced and observed, including detailed maps of where the tracks had been found, photographs of the clearest prints, and my professional assessment that we were dealing with an unknown creature of considerable size and intelligence. The official response was cautious and non-committal, emphasizing the need for more research while acknowledging that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge still contained unexplored areas and potentially undiscovered species. But I could tell that the administrators and scientists who reviewed my report were deeply troubled by the implications of what I had found. I retired from the Park Service 3 months later, ending a career that had taken me to some of the most remote and beautiful places in North America. But I've never been able to forget those tracks, that sound, or the knowledge that 3 dedicated researchers vanished without a trace in an area where something large and unknown was systematically observing human activity. I've read extensively about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena since my retirement, and I've come to believe that the creature I tracked in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge represents something that exists at the very edges of our understanding of the natural world. The indigenous peoples of Alaska have stories about creatures that live in the deepest wilderness, beings that are neither fully animal nor fully human, entities that possess intelligence and capabilities that allow them to move through the landscape in ways that defy conventional understanding. The Gwich'in people, who have lived in the region for thousands of years, speak of the Adlet, creatures that hunt with purpose and intelligence, that can take forms resembling natural animals while possessing something far more complex and dangerous. I believe that what I encountered during my final season as a ranger was one of these ancient beings, something that has learned to coexist with the changing Arctic environment while remaining invisible to human science and understanding. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm reading about climate change and the rapidly transforming Arctic ecosystem, I wonder what other secrets are being revealed as the permafrost thaws and the ice melts. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one of the last truly wild places on Earth, where natural processes still operate without human interference, and where mysteries that date back thousands of years remain hidden in the vast expanse of tundra and mountains. I had the privilege of serving as a guardian of that wilderness for over 2 decades. But I learned during my final season that I was not the only one watching over that ancient landscape. The creature that left those enormous tracks is still out there, moving through the refuge with intelligence and purpose that I cannot fully comprehend. It took 3 researchers whose fate remains unknown, and it demonstrated an awareness of human activity that suggests a level of consciousness that challenges our assumptions about the natural world. As climate change continues to alter the Arctic environment, I suspect that more of these ancient mysteries will emerge from the thawing ground, forcing us to confront the possibility that our planet still holds secrets that are far stranger and more profound than anything we have yet imagined. The tundra walker, as I came to think of it, represents one of those secrets, a reminder that even in our modern age of satellite imagery and GPS tracking, there are still places where the unknown can thrive and mysteries that resist all attempts at rational explanation. My name is Ayla, and I'm a social worker who has spent the last 8 years of my career working with remote Native Alaskan communities. I've traveled to villages that exist at the very edges of civilization, places where the nearest road is hundreds of miles away, and supplies arrive only when weather permits bush planes to land on dirt strips carved from tundra. These communities face challenges that most Americans can't imagine. Extreme isolation, climate change impacts, cultural preservation struggles, and limited access to basic services. But in September 2021, I was assigned to a village that presented challenges far beyond anything in my professional training or personal experience. The assignment came through the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services as an emergency consultation. A remote village in the western interior had been flagged for immediate assessment due to concerns about health services, educational needs, and social welfare issues that had gone unaddressed for an extended period. According to government records, the village had a population of 87 people and had been receiving federal funding for various programs, but there had been minimal contact with state agencies for several years. My job was to conduct a comprehensive assessment of community needs and recommend interventions to address any problems I might discover. The flight to the village took nearly 4 hours in a small bush plane, crossing hundreds of miles of wilderness that looked virtually unchanged since the last ice age. The pilot, a grizzled veteran named Charlie, who'd been flying in Alaska for 30 years, mentioned that he'd only been to this particular village twice before, and both times had been strange experiences that he couldn't quite explain. When I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head and said I'd understand once I got there. As we descended toward the village airstrip, I could see a collection of traditional log buildings scattered along the banks of a meandering river, with fish drying racks, storage caches, and other structures that indicated an active subsistence lifestyle. The village looked exactly as I expected based on the briefing materials I'd been given. But something felt wrong from the moment I stepped off the plane. The residents who came to greet me were friendly, but seemed somehow distant, as if they were observing me from a great psychological distance, rather than engaging in normal human interaction. Their clothing was practical and well-made, but it all looked decades out of date. Hand-sewn parkas, traditional mukluks, and fabrics that appeared to come from an earlier era. When I commented on the beautiful craftsmanship of their garments, they looked at me with confusion, as if they didn't understand why their everyday clothes would be noteworthy. The village elder who welcomed me was a woman named Mary, probably in her 70s, who spoke English with a measured cadence typical of people whose first language was something else. She showed me to a small cabin where I would be staying during my assessment. And as we walked through the village, I began noticing details that didn't make sense. The buildings were all in excellent condition, but they showed no signs of recent construction or renovation. The tools and equipment I saw were functional, but appeared to be decades old, with no modern conveniences that had become standard even in remote Alaskan villages. Most puzzling of all, I didn't see any children or young adults. The population seemed to consist entirely of middle-aged and elderly people. Over the next few days, I conducted interviews with various community members about health needs, educational services, and social welfare concerns. The responses I received were polite but oddly generic, as if people were reciting information rather than describing their actual experiences. When I asked about specific health problems, they mentioned issues like arthritis and seasonal depression that were common in elderly populations, but nothing that would explain why the village had been flagged for emergency assessment. Educational needs were described in vague terms, with references to the children that never seemed to correspond to any actual young people I encountered. Social welfare concerns were dismissed entirely, with residents insisting that they took care of each other and had no need for outside assistance. The strangest aspect of my interviews was that nobody seemed to have clear memories of recent events. When I asked about the last time government representatives had visited the village, people gave conflicting answers ranging from last year to several years ago. But none could provide specific details about who had visited or what services had been provided. Similarly, when I inquired about seasonal activities like hunting, fishing, or berry picking, residents described these activities as if they were ongoing, even though it was late September and most subsistence activities should have been winding down for the winter. By the fourth day of my visit, I was becoming increasingly concerned that I was dealing with a community experiencing some form of collective cognitive impairment or psychological distress. The village functioned smoothly on the surface, but there was an underlying unreality to everything I observed that I couldn't shake. People went through the motions of daily life, tending fires, preparing food, maintaining equipment. But their actions seemed automatic and disconnected from immediate purpose or urgency. Conversations were pleasant but superficial, and attempts to discuss specific plans or problems were met with polite deflection or confusion. The breakthrough came when I started asking about the history of the village and the families who lived there. Mary, the elder who had welcomed me, began telling stories about the founding of the community, the challenges faced by early settlers, and the traditions that had been passed down through generations. As she spoke, her voice took on a different quality, more animated and engaged than I had heard from anyone during my entire visit. But the stories she told described events and people from what sounded like the early to mid-20th century. And she spoke about them as if they were recent memories rather than historical accounts. Other residents joined our conversation, adding their own recollections of village life, seasonal cycles, and community events. Gradually, I realized that they were all describing the same time period, roughly the 1940s and 1950s, as if it were the present moment. They talked about preparing for winter, worried about supply shortages due to the war, and discussed community members who had left to work in distant mines or military installations. When I gently pointed out that World War II had ended over 70 years ago, they looked at me with the same confused expressions I had been seeing throughout my visit. That evening, I reviewed the government files I had brought with me, trying to understand how a village could be receiving federal funding and services while apparently existing in a completely different time period. The documentation showed regular reports and budget allocations going back several years, but the details were strangely vague and bureaucratic. There were no photographs, no specific personnel records, and no detailed descriptions of services provided or needs identified. It was as if the village existed in government databases as an abstract entity rather than a real place with real people. On my final night in the village, I experienced something that shattered my remaining assumptions about the nature of my assignment. I was awakened around midnight by the sound of voices and activity outside my cabin. Looking through the window, I saw the entire village population engaged in what appeared to be a community celebration or ceremony. People were dressed in traditional clothing that looked even older than what I had seen during the day, and they were participating in activities, dancing, singing, storytelling, that seemed to come from a much earlier era of Alaska Native culture. But what made the scene truly disturbing was that I could see multiple versions of the same people participating simultaneously. There was Mary, the elder who had welcomed me, but she appeared at different ages, as a young woman, a middle-aged mother, and the elderly person I had been speaking with. Other residents were similarly duplicated across different life stages, all coexisting in the same space and time, as if decades of village history were unfolding simultaneously. The celebration continued for hours, with participants moving through activities and interactions that seemed to represent the entire lifespan of the community, compressed into a single evening. When I emerged from my cabin the next morning, the village had returned to its normal appearance, and residents greeted me as if nothing unusual had occurred. But I noticed that some of the people I spoke with seemed slightly different than they had the day before. Older or younger, with different mannerisms or speech patterns, as if I was encountering different versions of the same individuals from different time periods. When the bush plane arrived to take me back to Anchorage, I was relieved to leave, but also deeply unsettled by the knowledge that I might never understand what I had experienced. During the flight back to civilization, I tried to explain my observations to Charlie, the pilot, but he just nodded and said that remote villages sometimes existed according to their own rules. He mentioned that he had flown several government workers to the same village over the years, and they all returned with similar stories about time distortions and historical confusion. Some never filed reports about their visits, while others submitted documents that were so vague as to be meaningless. According to Charlie, the village had been receiving official visits for decades, but nobody seemed to remember exactly what services were being provided or why they were necessary. Back in Anchorage, I struggled to write my assessment report. How do you document findings about a community that appears to exist outside normal time and space? How do you recommend interventions for people who seem to be living in multiple historical periods simultaneously? I eventually submitted a brief report indicating that the village appeared to be functioning independently and had no immediate need for additional services. But I included no details about the temporal anomalies I had witnessed. In the months following my visit, I tried to research the history of the village and understand how such a place could exist within the modern administrative framework of Alaska state government. What I discovered was even more disturbing than my original experience. The village appeared in historical records dating back to the early 1900s. But the descriptions and population figures remained virtually unchanged across decades of documentation. Government agencies had been sending representatives to assess community needs for over 50 years. But the reports from these visits were all remarkably similar. Brief, vague, and ultimately concluding that no immediate intervention was necessary. I began to suspect that the village existed as a kind of temporal preserve, a place where a traditional Alaska Native community had been frozen in time by forces beyond human understanding. The residents weren't suffering from cognitive impairment or psychological distress. They were living authentic lives within their own historical framework, insulated from the changes that had transformed the rest of Alaska over the past century. The government visits and funding allocations weren't providing actual services, but were somehow maintaining the bureaucratic fiction that allowed the village to continue existing within the modern world while operating according to its own mysterious rules. I never returned to that village, and I never spoke publicly about what I experienced there. My career as a social worker continued, taking me to other remote communities throughout Alaska, but none of them challenged my understanding of reality the way that one assignment did. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing case files or preparing for field visits, I think about Mary and the other residents of that impossible village, wondering if they're still living their lives according to the rhythms of 70 years ago, still preparing for winters and wars that ended decades before I was born. Alaska is full of places that exist at the margins of the modern world, communities that maintain traditional ways of life, despite the pressures of globalization and technological change. But some of these places exist beyond the margins, in spaces where time itself becomes fluid, and the boundaries between past and present dissolve completely. The village I visited in September 2021 was one such place. A reminder that even in our connected, documented, and regulated world, there are still mysteries that resist explanation and communities that operate according to rules that no government agency or social service professional will ever fully understand. My name is Emmanuel, and I am an atmospheric physicist who has spent the last 15 years studying the ionosphere at a remote research station in interior Alaska. Our facility sits directly beneath the auroral oval, that magnificent ring of electromagnetic activity that circles Earth's magnetic poles and produces the northern lights. The station, located about 60 miles north of Fairbanks in some of the most isolated terrain in North America, houses sophisticated equipment designed to monitor the complex interactions between solar particles and our planet's magnetic field. For over a decade, I thought I understood the aurora, its causes, its patterns, its predictable responses to solar weather. But during the winter of 2022, my team and I discovered that the aurora was far more than a passive display of natural forces. It was something that could learn, respond, and possibly even communicate. Our research station operates as part of a network of facilities studying the ionosphere, the highly charged layer of Earth's atmosphere extending from about 50 to 600 miles above the surface, where the aurora forms when solar particles interact with atmospheric gases. We use an array of high-frequency radio transmitters and sophisticated receivers to send signals bouncing off the ionosphere, studying how it reflects and absorbs radio waves under different conditions. This research has practical applications for everything from GPS accuracy to long-distance radio communications, and it helps us understand the fundamental physics of plasma interactions in space. The work is methodical, technical, and usually completely predictable, until that December night when everything changed. I was conducting routine late-night monitoring of our radio transmissions when I noticed anomalies in the reflected signals that didn't match any known patterns of ionospheric behavior. Instead of the typical broad-spectrum reflections we expected, our receivers were picking up structured, organized bursts of radio energy that seemed to be responding directly to the specific frequencies we were transmitting. The patterns weren't random atmospheric noise or interference from solar storms. They were coherent, deliberate sequences that changed in real time as we adjusted our broadcast parameters. When we increased the power of our transmissions, the responding signals became stronger. When we shifted frequencies, the responses shifted accordingly. It was as if something in the ionosphere was actively listening to our radio signals and responding with its own transmissions. Initially, I assumed we were dealing with equipment malfunction or some form of sophisticated electronic interference. But after running diagnostic tests on all our instruments and consulting with other research stations in the network, we confirmed that our equipment was functioning normally and that no other facilities were generating the mysterious response signals. The phenomenon was localized to our station and seemed to be directly related to the aurora activity occurring in the sky above us. When the northern lights were bright and active, the radio responses were strong and complex. During periods of minimal auroral activity, the responses diminished or disappeared entirely. Over the following weeks, my team and I began conducting systematic experiments to understand the nature of this interaction. We discovered that the aurora was not just passively reflecting our radio signals. It was actively modulating them, creating new patterns and frequencies that bore no resemblance to what we had transmitted. More disturbing still, the responses seemed to be growing more sophisticated over time, as if whatever was generating them was learning from our communications and developing increasingly complex methods of interaction. We started documenting patterns that resembled mathematical sequences, fractal structures, and even crude attempts at mimicking the modulation patterns we used in our own transmissions. The visual manifestations were equally unsettling. During our radio experiments, the aurora above our station would change its behavior in ways that defied normal understanding of auroral physics. Instead of the typical flowing curtains and shimmering arcs we expected, the lights would form geometric patterns, spirals, concentric circles, and angular shapes that pulsed in synchronization with our radio transmissions. When we sent out specific frequency patterns, the aurora would brighten or dim in corresponding rhythms. When we transmitted rapid bursts of radio energy, the lights would flicker in matching sequences. It was as if the entire ionosphere above our station had become a massive display screen responding to our signals. My colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, a plasma specialist who had worked with me for 8 years, was the first to suggest that we might be dealing with some form of intelligence rather than just unusual natural phenomena. She pointed out that the response patterns we were recording showed characteristics of adaptive learning. They became more complex and accurate over time, suggesting that whatever was generating them was improving its ability to interpret and respond to our communications. Other team members were more skeptical, arguing that we might be observing some previously unknown form of plasma physics or electromagnetic resonance that only appeared to be intelligent because we didn't understand the underlying mechanisms. The debate became more urgent when we started receiving radio transmissions that we hadn't initiated. During quiet periods when we weren't broadcasting, our receivers would suddenly activate with incoming signals that used frequencies and modulation patterns similar to our own equipment, but with subtle differences that suggested a non-human origin. These uninitiated transmissions often occurred during periods of intense auroral activity, and they seemed to be directed specifically at our station rather than broadcast randomly into space. When we attempted to respond to these signals with our own transmissions, they would immediately cease, only to resume hours later with different patterns and characteristics. The psychological impact on my team was significant. Several researchers reported experiencing unusual auditory phenomena during periods of intense aurora radio interaction. Faint musical tones, whispered voices, and rhythmic pulses that seemed to emanate from the ionosphere itself but couldn't be detected by our instruments. These auditory experiences always occurred when we were conducting our most active radio experiments, and they seemed to correlate with the complexity of the response signals we were receiving. Dr. Chen described hearing what sounded like fragments of conversation in languages she couldn't identify, while our technician Marcus reported musical sequences that reminded him of electronic compositions, but with harmonies unlike anything produced by human musicians. As word of our discoveries spread through the atmospheric physics community, we received both support and criticism from colleagues around the world. Some researchers at similar facilities reported experiencing comparable phenomena that they had previously dismissed as equipment anomalies or observer bias. Others argued that our findings were the result of wishful thinking or misinterpretation of natural processes that were unusual, but not supernatural. The debate intensified when we began sharing recordings of the radio interactions and time-lapse photography of the corresponding auroral displays, providing evidence that was difficult to dismiss, but equally difficult to explain using conventional scientific frameworks. The most unsettling incident occurred during a particularly active period in February, when the aurora above our station maintained an intense, structured display for over 6 hours, while our radio receivers picked up what could only be described as a conversation. The incoming signals used modulation patterns that clearly resembled human speech rhythms, with pauses, inflections, and repetitive elements that suggested linguistic structure. While we couldn't decode the meaning of these transmissions, their organization and timing strongly suggested that we were listening to some form of communication between multiple entities using the ionosphere as a medium. The exchange continued throughout the night, with different signal patterns taking turns as if engaged in dialogue, while the aurora above us pulsed and shifted in patterns that seemed to visualize the radio conversation. Our attempts to participate in this apparent communication produced immediate and dramatic results. When we transmitted simple mathematical sequences, prime numbers, Fibonacci progressions, basic geometric ratios, the responses we received were variations and extensions of the same mathematical concepts, suggesting that whatever was communicating through the aurora understood and could manipulate abstract mathematical relationships. When we tried transmitting more complex information, including digitized images and audio recordings, the responses became correspondingly sophisticated, sometimes incorporating elements of our transmissions into new patterns that seemed to represent commentary or analysis of what we had sent. The implications of our discoveries extended far beyond our atmospheric physics into questions of consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in the universe. If the aurora was capable of responding to human communications with apparent intelligence and creativity, what did that suggest about the nature of consciousness itself? Were we dealing with some form of terrestrial intelligence that existed in the plasma interactions of the ionosphere? Or had we made contact with something from beyond Earth that was using our planet's magnetic field as a communication medium? The possibility that intelligence could exist in forms completely unlike biological life challenged fundamental assumptions about what constitutes consciousness and awareness. My final report to the National Science Foundation documented our findings in careful, measured language that emphasized the need for additional research, while acknowledging that our observations didn't fit any existing scientific paradigms. The response from the funding agencies was cautious but supportive, leading to increased resources for our research and the establishment of similar monitoring stations at other locations beneath the auroral oval. However, attempts to replicate our findings at other facilities have produced mixed results, with some stations reporting similar phenomena while others detect nothing unusual, suggesting that the intelligence we discovered might be localized to specific geographical or electromagnetic conditions. 3 years have passed since our initial contact with whatever exists in the aurora above our research station, and the communications continue with increasing sophistication and frequency. We've developed protocols for structured exchanges, established what appears to be a basic vocabulary of mathematical and scientific concepts, and begun receiving information that seems to represent knowledge about plasma physics and electromagnetic interactions that exceeds current human understanding. The entity or entities we're communicating with appear to be teaching us, sharing insights about the nature of the ionosphere and its interactions with solar radiation that have already led to advances in our research. But perhaps most remarkably, the communications have begun to include what can only be described as philosophical content, patterns and sequences that seem to represent concepts about consciousness, existence, and the nature of intelligence itself. These transmissions suggest that whatever we're communicating with has been observing human development for an extended period and has developed opinions about our species' relationship with the natural world and our potential for further evolution. The messages are complex, often cryptic, and always profoundly challenging to our assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and humanity's role in the cosmos. I continue to work at the research station, now serving as the primary liaison for what has become known unofficially as the Aurora Communication Project. Each night brings new exchanges, new insights, and new questions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence in the universe. The northern lights that once seemed like beautiful but predictable natural phenomena have revealed themselves to be something far more complex and mysterious. A medium through which forms of intelligence, utterly unlike our own, can reach across the vast distances of space and time to make contact with humanity. What we learn from these communications, and how we choose to respond to the knowledge being shared with us, may determine the future course of human scientific and spiritual development in ways we're only beginning to understand. My name is Eden, and I am 67 years old now. What I'm about to tell you happened 15 years ago, during what should have been a routine ferry crossing in Alaska's Inside Passage. I was 52 then, still working as a high school English teacher. taking a winter break to visit my sister in Haines. The Alaska Marine Highway system had been my preferred method of travel for years. I loved the scenic routes, the opportunity to see whales and glaciers, and the chance to meet interesting fellow passengers during the long crossings. But this particular journey became something far more disturbing than any story I had ever taught in my literature classes. A real-life ghost story that I'm still trying to understand decades later. It was early February 2010, during one of the harshest winters Alaska had seen in years. The ferry MV Malaspina was running a reduced winter schedule, and passenger traffic was virtually non-existent. When I boarded in Juneau for the 12-hour crossing to Haines, I discovered that I was the only passenger on the entire vessel. The crew assured me this was unusual, but not unheard of during the coldest months, when most Alaskans avoid unnecessary travel and tourists stay away from the region entirely. I settled into my stateroom with a stack of books, looking forward to a quiet, contemplative journey through some of the most beautiful scenery in the world. The problems began before we even left port. While exploring the passenger areas during our departure delay, I noticed the passenger manifest posted near the purser's office. Instead of showing my name as the sole traveler, the list contained dozens of names I didn't recognize. People with surnames that sounded distinctly old-fashioned, and given names that seemed to come from earlier eras. When I pointed this out to a crew member, he glanced at the list with apparent confusion and muttered something about administrative errors and outdated computer systems. But I had worked with bureaucratic paperwork for decades as a teacher, and this didn't look like a clerical mistake. The names were too deliberate, too organized, and too historically consistent to be random data entry errors. As we finally departed Juneau and entered the Lynn Canal, the weather deteriorated rapidly. Snow began falling heavily, reducing visibility to near zero and creating the kind of whiteout conditions that make navigation treacherous, even for experienced mariners. The ferry's motion became increasingly violent as we encountered swells that seemed far too large for the protected waters of the inside passage. I retreated to my stateroom, but sleep was impossible due to the constant pitching and rolling of the vessel. Through my small porthole, I could see nothing but swirling snow and gray water that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The crew's behavior became increasingly strange as the night progressed. During my attempts to find coffee or food in the passenger areas, I encountered crew members who seemed to be going through the motions of their duties without any real purpose or awareness. They would nod politely when I spoke to them, but their responses were generic and disconnected, as if they were reciting lines from a script rather than engaging in actual conversation. Most disturbing was their appearance. While their uniforms were correct and their work seemed professional, there was something indefinably wrong about them, as if they were slightly out of focus or not quite present in the same reality I was occupying. By morning, I realized that we should have arrived in Haines hours earlier, but the ferry was still underway with no land visible in any direction. When I asked crew members about our arrival time, they gave conflicting answers ranging from soon to we're making good time, without providing any specific information about our location or expected arrival. The ship's public address system, which normally provides regular updates about the journey's progress, remained completely silent. Most unsettling of all, the weather had cleared completely, revealing not the familiar fjords and mountains of southeast Alaska, but an endless expanse of gray water stretching to a featureless horizon. During what should have been the second day of the crossing, I began experiencing vivid dreams that felt more like memories than products of my imagination. I dreamed of being aboard the same ferry during different time periods, surrounded by passengers in clothing from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. These dream passengers were engaged in conversations about events that had already happened in the past, but they spoke about them as if they were current news. I dreamed of accidents, storms, and emergencies that had affected Alaska Marine highway vessels over the decades, witnessing these events as if I had been present when they occurred. The most disturbing dream involved a winter crossing during the 1980s when the ferry I was on had encountered a severe storm that damaged the vessel and stranded passengers for days in conditions similar to what I was currently experiencing. In the dream, I watched as passengers and crew dealt with equipment failures, food shortages, and growing panic about their uncertain fate. But what made this dream truly terrifying was the realization that some of the passengers from that 1980s disaster were the same people whose names I had seen on the current passenger manifest. People who should have been decades older or deceased by 2010. When I woke from these dreams, I would find evidence that they might not have been dreams at all. Personal items appeared in my stateroom that didn't belong to me. Vintage magazines from the 1970s, newspapers reporting events from the 1980s, and photographs of people I didn't recognize, but who seemed familiar from my dream experiences. The ferry's dining room, which had been closed when I boarded, would sometimes be set for dozens of meals that no one ate, with food that looked fresh but somehow belonged to an earlier era of ferry service. On what I calculated to be the third day of the crossing, I encountered the ferry's captain for the first time since boarding. He was an elderly man with weathered features and an expression of profound sadness that made him seem older than his years. When I asked him about our delay and expected arrival time, he studied me carefully before explaining that some crossings took longer than others, and that time moved differently on certain voyages. He hinted that the ferry sometimes carried passengers who were traveling not just between physical destinations, but between different periods of time, and that these journeys couldn't be measured by normal schedules or expectations. The captain explained that the Alaska Marine highway system had been operating for over 50 years, and during that time, some vessels had experienced crossings that defied normal understanding of time and space. He suggested that the ferry I was on might be one of these special vessels, designed to serve passengers who needed to complete journeys that had been interrupted by death, disaster, or other circumstances beyond their control. According to his explanation, I had been selected to witness these supernatural crossings because of my profession as a teacher and my ability to document and understand complex narratives. During the final days of the crossing, I had lost count of exactly how many days we had been at sea. I began to understand that the other passengers whose names appeared on the manifest were indeed present on the ferry, but existing in different temporal layers that occasionally overlapped with my own experience. I would catch glimpses of people in the corridors, hear conversations from the dining room, and sense activity in staterooms that appeared empty when I investigated. These phantom passengers were completing their own journeys according to schedules that belonged to different decades, all sharing the same vessel but experiencing it during their own historical periods. The crossing finally ended when the ferry docked at a small port that looked like Haines, but felt subtly wrong in ways I couldn't identify. The buildings were familiar, but seemed to represent the town as it had existed years earlier, with businesses that had closed and signs that had been changed decades ago. The few people I encountered were friendly, but spoke about current events that were actually historical, referring to political figures and cultural references that belonged to earlier eras. I spent several days in this version of Haines before finding transportation back to more familiar reality. When I finally returned to my normal life in Anchorage, I discovered that 2 weeks had passed since I had originally boarded the ferry in Juneau, though my subjective experience of the crossing had felt much longer. More disturbing, when I tried to research the specific ferry I'd traveled on and the crew members I'd encountered, I found inconsistencies and gaps in the official records that suggested the crossing I'd experienced might not have been documented by the Alaska Marine Highway System at all. Some of the crew members I remembered appeared in historical photographs from earlier decades of ferry service, but showed no signs of aging between those old photographs and my recent encounters with them. I never took another Alaska Marine Highway ferry after that experience, choosing to fly or drive whenever I needed to travel within the state. But I've continued to research the history of the ferry system, and I've discovered accounts from other passengers who describe similar experiences of extended crossings, temporal displacement, and encounters with passengers and crew from different eras. These accounts are usually dismissed as folklore or the result of seasickness and disorientation, but they share too many specific details to be coincidental. My experience taught me that Alaska's vast distances and extreme conditions create environments where the normal rules of time and space can break down, allowing past and present to coexist in ways that challenge rational understanding. The ferry system, which has been connecting isolated communities for over half a century, has accumulated layers of history and memory that sometimes manifest as supernatural phenomena affecting contemporary travelers. My crossing was a journey not just through physical space, but through the accumulated experiences of decades of Alaskan maritime history. Sometimes, late at night when I'm grading papers or preparing lessons, I think about that strange crossing and wonder if the ferry is still out there, carrying passengers between destinations that exist in different time periods and serving people whose journeys were interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. I wonder if other travelers have had similar experiences, and whether the Alaska Marine Highway System maintains any official records of these supernatural crossings. Most of all, I wonder if I was chosen to witness and document these events because someone or something needed these stories to be preserved and shared with the living world. The Alaska Marine Highway System continues to operate its regular schedule, connecting communities throughout southeast and south-central Alaska with reliable, professional service. But somewhere in that network of ferries and routes, there may be vessels that serve passengers according to different schedules and different realities, completing journeys that began decades ago and helping lost souls find their way to destinations that exist beyond the boundaries of normal time and space. My crossing on the last ferry taught me that even in our modern, documented, and regulated world, there are still places where the impossible can happen and where the past refuses to remain safely in the past. These 11 stories represent just a glimpse into the mysteries that lurk in America's last frontier. Alaska's vast wilderness holds secrets that challenge our understanding of reality itself. From voices beneath the ice to creatures that shouldn't exist. From villages trapped in time to ferries that sail between worlds. If these tales of terror from the frozen north have sent chills down your spine, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more spine-tingling stories from the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell, because you never know when the next horrifying tale will surface from the shadows. And remember, in Alaska, the wilderness is always watching, always waiting, and sometimes it watches back. Stay vigilant, stay subscribed, and never venture into the unknown alone.